Perspectives, Finding Common Ground, a podcast series that brings together a panel of thought leader perspectives as a forum to socialize and problem solve education technology issues with the goal to ultimately find common ground.
Hello, I'm Patrick Devaney, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Perspectives, Finding Common Ground. Today, we're going to be talking about AI specifically in higher ed, and how to navigate this rapidly shifting landscape. I have three wonderful guests today joining me on the show, and I'm going to take this opportunity to have them introduce themselves and provide a little background on their perspective on this topic. I think we'll start with you, Amanda, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Bickerstaff. I'm the CEO and co-founder of AI for Education. We're fully focused on the responsible adoption of generative AI across the ecosystem, education from students in high school to colleges to working with ed techs like we did today. We really focus on the idea of responsible adoptions because this technology is very new, and it has a lot of capabilities, but a lot of limitations. And so we want to make sure that we have an informed group of educators and students so that we're making great decisions about the future of education.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Laura, I guess we'll have you go next.
Sure. I work at the University of Central Oklahoma. I'm a professor here in English and technical writing. I'm also the AI coordinator for campus, and I have a Facebook page that has over 6,200 people in it now that's meant as a learning community for educators in AI. I'm very excited to talk to people about all things AI related with education, both the good and the bad. And I consider myself a doorway for faculty to come into AI if they haven't gotten into it yet.
Fantastic. And Laura is Laura Dumin, correct? That's
Yes,
your
Laura
last
Dumin.
name?
Thank you. Yes.
Fantastic. Welcome. And next, last but not least, Victor, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hey, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Victor Karkar. I'm co-founder and CEO of an ed tech company called Scrible, which is a product and a company that I started originally rooted in my own needs as a student to help with the research and writing process. And so the product and the company are really focused on helping students and educators through the writing process. And we find ourselves, interestingly, kind of in the middle of sort of the AI sort of storm right now, because writing all of a sudden is gotten a lot more attention. Since there's been sort of, excitement and concerns around the impact of AI on the writing process. And in particular, I think the thing that we didn't really expect, which we can talk about a little bit more as a topic, is that we think we actually have sort of an interesting paradigm to try to address the AI plagiarism problem that is sort of concerning so many educators and even teachers in K-12. And that's where we started. We started in the K-12 world, but increasingly, especially over the last 18 months or so, we've been working increasingly in higher ed, and we've had lots of conversations with both educators and faculty in higher ed, as well as in K-12, about how they're looking at AI, what they like about it, what they're concerned about, and so we're really excited to kind of help usher in this new transition that we're all working on together.
Great. Thank you. And welcome to all of you. Let's start this conversation around the kind of distinctions or different aspects of AI in higher ed, because specifically we're talking about that. We've talked about it in K-12, and Victor just mentioned that, but how has AI evolved specifically in a different fashion? And then as we're talking about that, what has that impact had on learning and teaching and learning methodologies?
There's been a lot of shift that not everybody has started getting on board with yet, if that makes sense. So when I go out and talk to faculty, my big thing is that we have to be shifting everything that we've been doing. We can bring a couple of the things along, maybe some old baggage, but most of our baggage has to be new. We're going to have to buy new stuff when we get to our new stop. And that means thinking about how we want to do assessment, what matters now versus maybe what mattered before. How are we going to look at what students are doing for us? So if they do some writing for us, are we okay if they have some AI involved in it? What kind of guidelines do we have? If instructors don't put some kind of guidelines into their classrooms and into their assignments, what I'm seeing is that students are using AI in ways that are potentially unethical or disallowed in the classroom. So I think it's there's a big change in how we have to approach things to understand that the AI is here, and then to try and understand how our students might be using it.
Just as we're starting this conversation, I just want to situate us in a common language. So we talk about AI in higher education. AI in higher education has been around for decades. And so many technologies have used artificial intelligence in terms of machine learning models to help kids, even find scholarship opportunities, writing support, help, etc. But what we're talking about today is a shift towards generative AI. And generative AI is where we're actually going to have the ability for the artificial intelligence to do human-like things in a way that's never been possible before, like write an essay, a research paper, create a presentation, even create images and video if you have a student that's in a media arts course. And so what that has done is that has really exposed how much of our education system has been predicated on assessing students based on product and specifically written product. And so we have so much, whether that's a blue book where I still remember sitting down and writing out my essay, or if during COVID, a lockdown browser. That's something in which we had, those big term papers or dissertations. This idea of these presentations that have become more and more part of the zeitgeist after we have like PowerPoint and Google Slides. And so what's happened is I think we've exposed this model that is increasingly outdated. And that is something in which now we actually have a technology that is similar in the idea of a paradigm shift, like the graphing calculator for, geometry, or, higher level math, or the internet for research and access, or now we have this for the humanities. And so I think this is really what the question we have here today is that what happens when there's a paradigm shift that impacts 80 to 90% of how we assess students in higher education, and even 80% of how we identify who we even let into our institutions through college applications that are heavily essays, reference letters, et cetera, that are all written.
Yeah, and I think that if I can add on to that, I agree with that, and it's a lot of what we've seen in the conversations we've had with educators, both in K-12 and in higher ed. And historically, we've relied heavily on sort of the final work product, right? Which is something that Amanda and I have actually spoken about briefly before. Well, when the machine can actually generate the paper or the end work product in 30 seconds, or can answer a math or science or other question, in a few seconds, the whole way that we've relied upon assessment is sort of at risk, if you will. And I think to Laura's point earlier, it really makes us have to think about what are we assessing, right? And how should we go about assessing sort of both concept mastery as well as sort of skills mastery? And I think that's going to be a really important shift for everybody to have to make. And I think it's actually going to be a pretty significant sort of mental lift for people, because we've been so reliant upon sort of just looking at the end work product across all disciplines really since the beginning. Not that people haven't done formative assessment, not that people haven't done, sort of project oriented assessments, or, as Amanda pointed out, presentations. But I think the heavy reliance on sort of the end work product is something that really is going to change now, or should change, frankly.
Yeah, I agree that that move to process, I think i- is easier in some fields than it is in others. If you're looking at, for example, a chemistry exam, and you can go out and have a large language model do most of that work for you, how do you assess if the student actually understands it? The process is a little harder. With things like English composition classes, I think it can be a little bit easier because you can have students turn in drafts. You can have students talk to you. I have my students do reflective pieces on all of their work that talk about their process. So, how did they come to this draft? Who did they see their audience? What kinds of revisions did they do? And then also transparency about their AI use. So, I do allow my students to use AI with transparency and within the guidelines that I give them.
Laura, I think it's interesting that one piece that we've been thinking a little bit about here in our work is sort of the meta thinking on the writing, right? So
Mhm.
it's not just about the writing itself, but essentially how do you think about the process? And so
Yeah.
when you say having them think about their audience and all that, that's kind of another layer that you can put into it, that is a little different than how folks historically, engage with the process. And I think that's interesting.
I was going to throw a wrench in. Well, welcome to Amanda. Both Laura and Victor know me, so they're not going to be surprised by this. But is this even the right question we should be asking about? Can we do a better job of assessing current ways in which we have higher education work, knowing that when the students graduate and they go to the workforce, they're going to be heavily like expected to be augmented by artificial intelligence. They're going to know how to use GPT-4 and other tools to do their work. I mean, and so what we're talking about today is kind of rethinking what exists today and essentially rethinking what should exist today and what will need to exist for tomorrow. And I think that that is like when you talk about the doorway, Laura, I love that framing. But like this doorway needs to be like a portal. Like it doesn't, like it shouldn't be a doorway. It should feel like a spaceship. Or if you loved, what was it, the Star Trekky one where you could go through Stargate? There we go. I'm a nerd.
Yes.
But you can walk through that piece, and then the place that comes after it does not look like the place it started. And I think that that's really what I think is a bigger question here is that the industrial model and or the classical model that we see often in liberal arts colleges has been outdated for a really long time. And so are we going to take this moment to make more than incremental change, or are we going to back into just trying to make it fit within the new paradigm of generative AI can do this?
Are there any tools or frameworks that you can recommend or suggest that could be used to facilitate or guide the use of AI in that fashion?
Yeah. So, I revamped everything in January of 23, absolutely everything. And I was already doing things in a slightly different way to begin with. So we spend a lot of time in my English composition classrooms talking to each other. We read and then we come in and we talk because I think critical thinking skills are one of the most important things that we can teach our students. And I want to know that they have an understanding of what we just read. So I want to hear from them. And I put them into small groups to talk first so that everybody has a chance to share. And then we come back together as large groups. And then if introverts don't feel comfortable talking in that large group, they've talked in small group. If we've got somebody who comes to class unprepared that day, not that that ever happens, but if it were to, then at least they're still getting the information by listening to their peers. So learning becomes a participative thing as opposed to just like a rote, we're doing this thing. And I do agree, Amanda, like everything has to shift because especially from the tech writing perspective, I want my students to be able to show an employer that they're ready to go when they hit the ground because the employers don't want to take time to try and explain augmentation to them, augmented writing. And yet I'm still facing pushback, surprisingly, from the students as well as the faculty. The students aren't sure about the AI. They feel like using large language models is a shortcut that they're not ready to take, or they feel like it is cheating or it's uncomfortable for them. So it's not just that we're working to retrain faculty. We also have to help students understand what it is that they're going to be expected when they get out. Like, what do they have to do? And then we have to help them understand why it matters for them to still have this learning and knowledge in all of the AI stuff. So it's like this whole new way of teaching and explaining things as well.
If I can maybe sort of share a little bit of what I've learned, because we've spent a lot of time talking to educators about this across K-12 and higher ed. I think Amanda's question is really interesting. It's kind of provocative in a way, because it's sort of saying, hey, it's not just a question of adapting to this new reality. It's about whether or not the new reality should look completely different. I think in early adopter communities, which I would argue everybody on this podcast is, there's a tendency to sort of say, hey, there's a totally different paradigm. And I don't disagree with that. I think that there's a totally different paradigm with augmented writing, for example. I think personally that we should be careful, though, that we don't sort of toss the baby out with the bathwater, because there's something really important that could be lost if you kind of go completely to the extreme of let's do completely augmented. And that the thing that could be lost that we've discovered is sort of the foundational skills that to some extent we all take for granted today because it has been part of the traditional model. And so what we've seen in both K-12 and higher ed is that there are these different camps that emerge, right? Oftentimes it's English faculty, but not only English, that are really worried about the AI plagiarism problem and cheating, and students who are taking the shortcut, like Laura mentioned. At the other end of the spectrum, you oftentimes have instructional folks that are really technology savvy, sort of, making the argument that Amanda's making about, hey, we need to kind of adapt to this new reality and what's going to work in the workplace and preparing students for the future. And where I've kind of come out, which I think is in the theme of this podcast of Common Ground, is that there's actually the truth is somewhere in the middle, in the sense that both sides are not wrong, but we have to both make sure that the humans know the foundational skills, but are also prepared to be able to use those foundational skills to best use the AI tools that are available in this future paradigm. And so I've really been arguing for it's not either or, it's really both. And that's kind of what we've been focused on. And in the work we've been doing, we've been a little bit more to date focused on making sure that the traditional skills are not lost in the process. But in the new work we're doing going forward, we're going to be looking at how you can actually sort of integrate AI into an augmented writing process going forward. People haven't seen that from us yet, but that's something that we're working on behind the scenes.
I just want to say balance is important, but I'm gonna cite Amara's law. We tend to overestimate the impact in short term and underestimate the impact of long term effects of these technologies. And so, while absolutely we do not want to throw baby with bathwater, and I'll get back to your question, Patrick, in this moment, that I think we are underestimating what this really will mean in 10 years because we know that early reading and early math tools are going to come to market in the next 2 years. They're going to fundamentally change how we teach reading and math in elementary school and even in pre-K. And I think that that is where we're going to start to see like fully bespoke reading and math opportunities where the foundational skills may be, if done right, as easy as possible for a student to acquire in a way that is meaningful for them. And as long as it remains accessible in terms of costs, which is a huge question that I don't even know if we'll get to, just how expensive these technologies are and will remain until we have better processing power, that this is something that is really, really interesting. But when we talk about what Laura is talking about, Patrick, your question about, what theories and methods we can go to, what Laura's talking about is good pedagogy, good andragogy is this. Like, we as higher education professional, I have been a professor, we expect to have people come into a classroom and we put knowledge in their heads in multiple ways and then they regurgitate it back to us. We don't connect it to durable skills like critical thinking all that often, communication, collaboration in meaningful ways, other than giving a group project and go do and come back when you're done. And we're going to give you no support in that. We also don't do things where we connect it to the real world. Like, why aren't schools in higher education embedding work related skill sets? Like, if you're teaching tech writing, are they creating manuals or are you just teaching them how to write an essay in a technical face? I'm not going to talk about you, Laura, but I'm saying, like, are they actually learning to write within that format and maybe getting feedback from industry in that process? And so I think that all of these things around authentic assessment, work connected, durable skills, we know works. We just don't do that in higher education. And we definitely don't do it consistently in K-12. But I will say that K-12, there are many more pockets, especially in like K-5, where we see this kind of being the focus. But it seems like we lose it every year and we become more and more like vessels that we put information in. And then we expect them to go into the world and apply that information in unique and meaningful ways. And oftentimes they're not prepared.
I don't disagree with a lot of that. I would just say that we've spent a lot of time talking to community college folks, and you got to remember that I think there's sometimes a difference, right? Higher ed is not monolithic. There's different types of programs, and the programs that are sometimes more sort of career oriented, I think, obviously do a better job of the kind of thing Amanda's talking about. And so I just wanted to kind of draw that distinction and that nuance because there are programs where they are more sort of workforce minded. They're more kind of durable skills minded in terms of what's actually used in the workforce.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think I was specifically talking about more of the liberal arts college approach, which I think is potentially a
Sure.
little bit more afraid of this moment in time. So beautiful
Sure.
point.
Well, and I also see some difference between, the Ivies R1, R2s, and then smaller colleges like the one that I'm at, and then community colleges where I'm a whole lot less concerned about cheating because there's so much transparency in my class. Like I come in and I show my students, hey, look at this outline that Claude built for me. Let me show you the paper that I wrote off of this outline. Let me tell you why I chose to use an outline and what did I keep and what did I let go of. My 11-year-old is in coding and he has Bing up sometimes when he's doing his coding because he needs the Bing chat to help him understand what he's doing in his coding class. Right. And so I think like all of that, showing our students what we're doing, telling them why we're doing it. And then again, coming back to, okay, if you're an engineer, you need to know how to build a bridge that's safe. You need to know how, if you're an architect, you need to be able to build a safe building, right? But where can you then have AI help? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people get caught up on because they're so worried that their students are going to cheat, that they're forgetting that there are some really awesome things that AI augmentation can help with. We just have to figure out where it makes sense for us individually and then also with our classes specifically.
Laura, can I ask you a question about the way your educators are thinking about this? Because you mentioned a few times that there's a lot of folks that are worried about cheating. When you all are having the discussion, has there been sort of a discussion about using AI in the teaching versus using AI in the learning? Because that's one of the things we've kind of talked about, right? That in our work this last year, that we oftentimes throw teaching and learning together into the same bucket, but the reality is they're not. They're two different things. And so to Amanda's point earlier, there'll be lots of great solutions that might come to market, like she said, in 2 years that might help with early reading. And that might be on the instructional side. And the question is, what's the difference between that and the student potentially using it for themselves in their own work? And just to maybe just add a little bit more to that to explain why I'm asking that question. In our work, since we're in the writing process, we've seen, again, those two camps emerge. And oftentimes the camp that's really fearful, like the educators you're talking about that are worried about cheating, are worried about student misuse, whereas the folks at the other end of the spectrum are oftentimes citing examples of great productivity use for the educator. So things like, helping to plan a course or a K-12 lesson planning and whatnot. And we sort of say, like, well, actually, yeah, it is being misused. We see data that says that. It's also potentially being used in a fantastic way by educators. Those are two very different use cases, right? They're not the same thing. And what's happening, unfortunately, is I think a lot of times people are conflating the two, or they're talking past one another because they're both not wrong, but they're not having a conversation about the same use case. So I'm wondering, when people are worried, and are they kind of making that distinction between students using it versus educators using it and how they're using it?
I try to help them see that we can do certain things with it, and then we can teach our students how to learn in certain ways with it. But I feel like we're not there yet in a lot of conversations because a lot of people still are so focused on our students are going to cheat, they're not going to bother to learn. And from talking to my own students, they want the knowledge. They understand that they have to have that foundational information. They're not quite sure about the AI augmentation to help them get through all of that yet. Still working on that. But I'm not sure that educators are really fully straddling that line yet.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I feel like Patrick was like, we really want you to talk to each other. And then like, we won't let Patrick talk. Like, I just want to say
All
that,
right.
like,
Sure.
you have this panel that you're like, yeah, you guys talk. Thinking we wouldn't just completely take up all the time. But I'll say the one thing I think is really interesting is that mm, right now, the best model on the market is GPT-4. And if you talk about equity, that is not inexpensive for a student on top of things like their textbooks and all their extra stuff. It's $20 a month per person. And it is still the best, right? It requires prompt engineering and thinking and support, but it does some amazing things across multimedia. And I think that when you talk about what we look at, like to be able, so like you look at the ASU partnership with OpenAI, it would cost them 10% of their budget to get not GPT teams, not even the safe version, but the $20 one where they can't even connect to each other and the data will be trained. It'd be 10% of their operating budget to give it to their students and their teachers. And so this is something I think is really, really interesting when we do talk about that line between student use and teacher use, is that right now, at least, it's prohibitively expensive to equip people with the best technology on the market in this moment in time. And there doesn't look like there's any real competitor. Gemini Ultra maybe, which is the new, which is like Google's been threatening about it for a while and says it's better, but we still haven't seen it to market. But I do think this is a really interesting space where I think that when we go forward, until these tools are more accessible, we're going to see where I think it's just we're going to see that unevenness that Laura is talking about, and this unevenness that you're talking about, Victor, in terms of who uses it, who doesn't, who has access, and the beliefs about these tools. Because when you show people how to use these tools effectively and demystify what they are and aren't, and then give them like our prompt library as an example, a place to go and actually try in a meaningful way, you start having a completely different conversation. But if I don't give them the tool, we never get to that second level because I can tell you till the cows come home, it'll help you write a rubric in 10 seconds. Or if I'm a student, it'll help me quiz me in a way that's meaningful to me. Until you use it, those are all words. Those are only words. When you do it, like, and you see that possibility is when it starts transforming the conversation and the rhetoric shifts and it becomes more about value and where the next steps are. But again, these tools are not that accessible and that there are not lot budgets that are being spent on people like Laura spending a lot of time talking, myself, I know a lot of us out there. there's just not that budget yet or that focus or that ability to bring this in both with training and the best model to make that shift.
When I talk to faculty, I only talk about the free tools. When I talk to my students, I only talk about the free tools. So, I'm loving Claude right now. It does a really good job. It gives great follow-up questions when I say clarify before you answer my question. And so that's the one that I'm really working with right now. I'm also teaching students about Perplexity and then typeset.io. So we're playing around with some of these tools, but I'm only focusing on the free ones because of that equity issue. I don't have any of the paid versions myself either. My university does not allow us to use professional development funds to pay for subscriptions. And that seems to be what I'm seeing from other people as well. And you're right, it is an equity issue. It's also an equity issue that you have to have a good internet connection. And I live very close to rural areas here in Oklahoma where people might have to go to the McDonald's parking lot to do their homework. We saw a lot of that during COVID. And that becomes an equity issue too. We also have the equity issue of students who can learn how to use these tools and become very tech savvy with them, and the students who don't have the time and energy to do that. And so they're not tech savvy, and then they are getting caught by AI detectors. We have the students who understand the critical thinking skills enough to say, oh, that's a really weirdly designed picture of somebody who looks exactly like a stereotype, right? If we're using Dali to make some pictures. Um, and I think if we're not getting into all of the access and equity issues, if we're also not helping our students who might be on the developmental writing stage to understand that the AI doesn't necessarily say things better than them. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want my students using AI to fix their grammar. I want to hear their voices because, unfortunately, these large language models all condense things down into kind of a bland, stereotypical academic American English. And I don't want to hear that from my students. And so I think we have to make our students aware of that. We have to make them aware that these biases are built into the system and they can't just take the output as it is. They have to think about it, interrogate it, and figure out what it actually means for them.
So, a couple thoughts. One is I think that the cost differential issue is a real one, and I think it's going to be there, and it's going to probably worsen the sort of general sort of inequity issue we've had with education and technology for a long time, right? I think the pandemic actually helped alleviate that a little bit because there was a massive investment made in learning technologies and in K-12, obviously devices with Chromebooks and things like that. But I think it's just going to be the next stage of that. And the thing I worry about a little bit is if AI is as transformational as we believe it is, and if it's going to have as big of an impact and as quick of an impact as Amanda's saying, for example, then that gap grows faster now, right, from between the haves and the have-nots. So that's a real concern. The one thing that makes me feel a little bit better to mitigate that concern is we know historically, due to Moore's law, cost comes down, significantly, and I think we're already seeing that a little bit, and hopefully that'll make the gap not grow as quickly as it otherwise could. In terms of, how folks use it, the AI literacy question that Laura's talking about, people not necessarily having the time or the energy to learn that well. I think that's incumbent upon the ecosystem, right? Educators, partners that work with them, folks like us, folks like Amanda, to kind of really help sort of emphasize the importance of AI literacy. And to be quite honest with you, not just in our ecosystem, but actually bringing that to legislators and sort of the general mainstream community to sort of say, this is an important part of literacy because it's going to impact how people learn when the education system, but also the impact that will have on them when they become citizens in society after they've graduated. Right? I think that's an important thing that needs to be kind of pushed generally.
Yeah, totally agree. And to the implementation challenges, I think that there are quite a few. I would say, Patrick, one of the biggest ones is that the technology isn't that good yet. And I think we forget that because it's like amazing. Like it's like, oh my gosh, large language models can do things that have never been possible before. But if you think back to the cell phone, the internet, I mean, dial up, remember dial up and someone called your mom and you had to come off? Like, I'm old. Like, this is real that we had these technologies that weren't great right out of the box. And now we have our first, I would say, unexplainable technology where they're black boxes and black box consumer facing technology that has severe limitations. So I would combine the implementation and the ethical piece. It has significant bias, as Laura's identified. Global North, American, English language, has huge biases, has ungrounded inferences. If you upload a picture of someone, it will not just give you like just normal stereotypes if you ask for them. It'll tell you a stereotype and you don't even have to ask. It'll just be like, you're not a CEO, Amanda, because you're not a man. And like that's a real thing that I was able to get ChatGPT for Turbo to tell me. This is true, the vision. And I think that there's things like that, the bias, the hallucinations, the way these models work, the reason why, Laura, you talk about that generic bland is that they're essentially creating, probabilities like based on how words go together and train in data sets. And if you see a very kind of adjective heavy purple prose paragraph over and over again, that's what you're going to get unless you're a good prompter. And so we see that as part of this. And they're always making things up and don't have an internal compass. So it often gets things wrong, which we call hallucinations. And so there are all kinds of people that have gotten sued, disbarred, fined, for accidentally submitting case brief or a academic paper that had made up stuff in it. And I think that that's where it gets so interesting. Microsoft put out their future of work piece today, and their big negative takeaway is that people over relied on the accuracy of the outputs. When they used Microsoft Copilot, they would take it wholesale, believe that new technology that is less than 2 years old, and cut and paste it and say, it's right. And it would make up facts, figures. It would attribute a quote to someone that doesn't say it or maybe doesn't exist. And I think that that's part of both the ethical component, but also implementation. How do you go to a higher education institution and say, you can't embrace it fully, you can't ignore it? It's like, but you have to be able to build this space in between.
So I totally agree with you. And I think this is an extension of the problem we already have, which is a lot of people think if it's on the internet, it must be true, right? And I think AI has the possibility of making that worse because all of a sudden now it becomes something that feels human. So like it feels like you can trust it because you built a relationship with it, hypothetically in your head. And given that the fact that it's trained on a lot of internet data, I think it potentially has the risk of making that existing problem even worse. I will say that I think fundamentally, to go back to kind of the basics, to kind of make a case for the foundational skills again, if you're able to help humans understand the foundational skills, they have potentially the skepticism and the critical thinking skills to be able to see some of that stuff and know that maybe that doesn't look quite right, right? And that's why I think that it's really important that, again, in this transition, we don't kind of lose that piece because we're running towards the shiny object that this new technology is. And that's a lot of what we help with and what we kind of preach. Again, not to say anti-AI, that this new technology is amazing, it should be used, but in the process, let's make sure that the humans are continuing to develop those underlying core skills that help them understand what's looks true and it isn't, but also to use that technology better because they understand what good looks like.
Yeah, I think using the AI specifically in STEM classes is really both cool and scary because these large language models don't always do a great job with math problems or with science problems. Sometimes the coding is great and sometimes the coding doesn't do what you want it to do. But I think that instructors, because they know their material better, can pull this down and go, oh, look, there's a problem here. I'm going to give this to my class. I'm going to put them into small groups and I'm going to have them figure out where the problem is, maybe why that problem showed up, what the actual answer should be. So it can become a learning tool, but the instructors, again, have to be comfortable enough with the information to turn it into a learning tool. And students, when they build things like problem sets or study guides, need to be aware that they do have to go back to their books, their coursework, and make sure that they are actually getting the right answer in those study guides. So it can be really cool with, again, those caveats that we have to have that AI literacy for ourselves and for our students.
Absolutely. The only thing I'll say is that we are all about balance, but we cannot take away the fact that the decisions that OpenAI make about the interface in which they build is a huge reason why we have built trust in places that we probably shouldn't. So conversational AI is what we talk about today because OpenAI had an experiment and it was the easiest way to get it in front of people as quickly as possible. It wasn't because it was safe. It wasn't because it was the best interface. It wasn't because it had the most accuracy or it was the most fun or interesting. It was because it was the easiest to get in front of as many people as possible. And now conversational AI is hugely a part of what we're doing, even though it actually, I will tell you, we have a myths and facts component. I've trained probably 30,000 people directly on like an intro to generative AI since June, and I love it. It's great. Educators, leaders, higher ed professionals, students. And one of our 5 questions we ask at the beginning, if it's a myth and fact, is AI can think like humans. We will have up to 50% of participants say yes, up to 50%. And this is it's not necessarily because maybe it's, like Skynet and Data and like all, her and I found out that Data had an evil brother, by the way. So even though it was a
Yeah.
positive, I learned that he had an evil brother last week, which is quite funny because I was so proud of myself for finding a positive, pop culture reference. But like with that, but then also the way that's been developed where it doesn't identify, it's been told in its system prompt to not say, I don't know,
Mhm.
to be encouraging, to be positive, to continue to provide authoritatively these pieces, and to be in a conversational framework that feels like we have to say please and thank you in some cases. And I think that that's where it gets really interesting that we have to lie some of this at the feet of the people building these tools, knowingly that they do have major impacts in terms of trust, they have impacts in terms of misconceptions and use. And I think that that's where I'm hopeful. There's an example of Common Sense Media and OpenAI have come together and saying they're going to look at safety for kids and all these things. And I'd love to see that because I think we kind of put it all on the shoulders of a professor or a student to be able to see that this standard is from 2023. So it can't possibly be right because the knowledge cutoff is 2022. And I think that that's where it's like, how hard would that be to get, like, to have that level of expertise and in a place that we've been built to trust over the last 20 years of technology and the way it's been developed? It's putting so much burden on people and users to make those decisions in ways that I don't know if we have, Victor. I love the foundational skill piece, but I don't know if we have the schema and the ability to do that as these tools become more sophisticated.
So, a couple things. One, first of all, I'm glad that you brought up like the responsibility of the makers, right? I think that that's a really important thing that honestly sometimes gets overshadowed by these other topics that we discuss. I'm not going to go deep into it, but I'm just going to throw out a topic in case anybody wants to latch onto it for later. I think one of the things that's been really under discussed is frankly um, copyright and the ability for the large language model makers to basically just go and suck up all kinds of content and say that, hey, we've vacuumed this up and we get to use it to build this thing that makes us a lot of money. Obviously the Hollywood writer strike and there's been lawsuits and other things that have been put out there that have really questioned like whether or not the makers of large language models have the right to do what they're doing. I think it's a really interesting discussion. I think it doesn't get enough discussion, frankly. So that's a thing that we could talk about later as well. In terms of the foundational skills and whether or not we've got the schema to do it, I guess I'll do just a very brief shameless plug, I think, because it's something that we realize that we think we can help with. When it comes to writing, which is the part that Laura and I think, we kind of think about this stuff in the English and writing realm a lot. A lot of folks had thought that, geez, how are we going to deal with the downside risk of like AI plagiarism, right? And they thought it was going to be these AI detectors. And that hasn't worked out, as everybody knows. They're not very reliable. And so because of the work we've always done, we actually realized this whole process over product thing early on, basically about a year ago. And with the work we've been doing, in the way our platform works is we help students through the writing process. So we help them curate their sources, annotate their evidence, cite their sources, build an outline, build a bibliography, and then integrate with the word processor. We make all that visible to the instructor. And so you actually can see the process. And when the student, for example, submits their assignment or their paper, all that work comes along with it. And you basically are able to see it. And so what we've been saying is that the way to try to sort of retain some of the value of the foundational skills, despite this onslaught of this new technology that becomes a burden for instructors, is actually give them tools to be able to see the process and make it visible. And that's what we've been able to do. Again, not because we designed that specifically because ChatGPT came out, but it's the work we were already doing because it's pedagogically sound for the writing process. And in short, what we're kind of preaching is that in the writing space, if you can do that, it really kind of changes the game. And I think in the work we're doing at Scrible, what we're proud to say is that we're able to help do for writing what we've always asked students to do in math, which is show your work. And if you can do that, that really kind of makes the process of a product much easier to manage as an instructor. So that's kind of our contribution to that conversation. But of course, there's lots of topics around that as well.
And now I'm going to throw a wrench into it. AI can do all of that for you. Um, whether we like it or not, students go into, say, Google Docs, they go out for a minute to ChatGPT or Claude or Bing or Bard or whatever, have it write it, they stick it into ChatGPT or into Google Docs. So then you can see all of the different drafts. So then they go back out to their AI and say, fix it so that it does this, and they stick it back in. So I'm all about process over product. And I think what you're doing is really cool. But people have to realize that's not a silver bullet either. Even as we're looking at all of the work, it's like, well, did they actually do it? And I think that's where, Amanda was talking about how it's a whole paradigm shift and everything's changing. And maybe we need to rethink this educational system that hasn't been working very well for a while. Because if we don't convince students that it's worth it to do the work, then even though we can see all of their process, did they actually do the process? And if they're not convinced that it matters to them, then they're probably not going to do it.
Laura, I think you're right. I would say that I think there are no silver bullets, right? I think what
Yeah.
we're trying to offer is something that is sort of a much more pedagogically sound alternative than trying to use a detector. The one thing I would say though is that the way you described how AI can do it is a heavy reliance upon the text in the document. And there's a lot that actually people do in the pre-writing process that isn't captured in the document. And that's part of where we support that process. And we sometimes get people that will say, well, couldn't they do this part in AI and then didn't do this part in AI? I'm like, well, by the time you do all that stuff with a copy and paste, you've actually done so much workaround. You might as well just do the work,
Yeah.
frankly.
Oh, well,
There's,
we say that, but this is I think kids will and teachers, I love it when a professor or teacher spends a whole 3 hours looking for something and it would take them an hour to do it. I think we
yeah,
we underestimate cognitive load and what it feels like to cut and paste versus to think of
yeah,
something new. And
sure.
so I think that it's a really interesting piece. And there's proof of effort, proof of originality. There are not biometric, but linguistic signatures that people are looking into. I would say I don't want to leave people with the feeling that this is all, negative. I think that it is important to recognize though that this moment in time is an opportunity to not just reinforce what we can currently do that maybe you do because it's habit or because it's expected, but this is the opportunity to move ahead. And I love, Laura, your point about a kid might spend 3 hours cutting and pasting because they don't think it's that important and they could do it while they're watching a TV show or listening to music or talking to a friend. But if you make it meaningful, if we have authentic work, or if it feels like it actually will have value, especially in a world where higher education is very expensive and
Mhm.
people are coming out with a lot of debt, is that this is an opportunity maybe to have it doesn't have to be I'm not saying the portal needs to immediately go to Stargate 1, but what's the place that we start to move forward into that world where we take these steps that are meaningful and we take this as an opportunity to improve and
Mhm.
not improve an opportunity to reinforce, which
I think
I'm really interested in improving.
And I think you hit on something really important that's actually sort of always been an important issue, but I think it became very clear during the pandemic, right? So in our working K-12, and I think this happened in higher ed as well, you talk to instructors who are like, well, we're doing remote learning and the students are there and they're on Zoom, but their cameras are off. So I don't really know if they're doing or engaging or listening, et cetera. And I think the lesson that many folks learn, which I'm afraid that we might be forgetting now that we've gone back to in person, is that when when you can't rely on the compliance model of, hey, they're in front of me in class, and there's a social pressure of being able to answer the question or cold calling on them or whatever it is, and you can't rely on the compliance model, which fell away during the pandemic. What you really need to rely on is basically inspiration and motivation. How do you ignite that? How do you make the content, the topic, the work interesting to them? And that's something we're thinking about as well. But I think that's an important thing that will make the work worth doing. That will for Laura's students, I'd imagine the ones that are saying, hey, I want to learn the skills. It's because there's an inherent and intrinsic value of the experience to learn the skills and learn the material, right? And I think AI or not, that's always been a concern. And I think right now it becomes even more important because if there's an easy way to work around it, you really want them to be inspired to want to actually learn, whether you're using AI or not, frankly.
So we're running short on time. I hate that because I love this conversation. You guys are fabulous. I if you had this if you had to look forward to one area that communities, ed tech companies, and academia could focus on for positive change with the use of generative AI, what would that collaboration be? What would that area of focus be? And how do we lean into it? Again, the thought behind this podcast is what can we do common ground and focus on for the positive? What would you suggest there in terms of an area that we should really lean into and encourage?
I think I'm most interested in personalization at scale. I think that you talk about all we've been talking about and making it meaningful, of foundational skills, of tying it to durable skills, of pathways to a positive future, is that we are all different. We are all motivated and we are all supported and encouraged and inspired by different things. We also need different things. I know, Laura, you are a huge advocate for this because you embody it. Like, we need to be able to meet people where they are and stop expecting that this idea of the middle, of going towards the middle of that bell curve, is going to get people where they need to be. And so I think that I get most excited about personalization of learning that takes not just the skills you need or and what you want to do, but your interests. Like, if there is a motivator that you're just so interested by, we know that kids, no matter who they are, and adults, if you hit them at the point of motivation and interest and spirit, like and within their zone of proximal development, they learn and succeed. And I think that that is what the opportunity is here. So I love ed techs to focus on this, technology companies, instructors, but faculty, students to have a voice, because I think that that's where, to me, we're going to see this remarkable difference in how people learn and what is possible.
I'm all about accessibility. As Amanda said, I do embody it. I live it, and it matters to me. And I think it's not just accessibility like, oh, you can physically get to the classroom. It's accessibility that we've got students who get very anxious over the blinking cursor. So if we can use the AI to help them brainstorm, now they don't have a blinking cursor that they're staring at, they've got some ideas. Or if we can help them with the drafting stage, they don't disappear from our classrooms because they couldn't get a draft done. And then they're just like, oh, I'm not going to be able to pass the class, so I'm just going to get an F and I'll come back and try it again later, right? There's a huge accessibility issue there. And that can increase our retention rates too, in ways that don't take away from the rigor of the classroom. So again, going back to the process, okay, well, what's the prompt that you used? What's the draft that you got? How did you take that draft and then turn it into your own? What did you add to it to make it yours? And we can take students who, we have a lot of first generation students, a lot of non-traditional students who might be working 20 to 40 hours a week or older, or who have family work that they're doing as well. And for them, they don't have the time to sit down and spend, 8 hours on a paper one day. They're trying to make everything fit into those spaces. So I think the more that we can make education accessible to the students who want to be there, and the more that we can help them, that's going to be great. And so I'm really excited about that.
My overarching principle is I think I want the technology to make humans better. And what better means can mean different things based on your stage of life and your role. So we focus a lot on making sure that the AI is able to support students, for example, in their cognitive development. But adults in the workplace, maybe in terms of productivity, right? So what you optimize might be different based on who you are. To Amanda's point, personalization. But I think that that's kind of the overarching thing that we want to look for. And it's not just about AI. I think it's technology in general. You want to make sure that the technology is serving us as humans and that it's helping the human mind and human productivity. So maybe that's too broad, but that's kind of a kind of.
No. I'm thrilled for this conversation. I can tell you, I'm so glad that I didn't have a chance to talk more, because it was far more interesting than me saying it. But I'm going to do something that I try to do here and kind of summarize some of these thoughts. I want you to tell me what I missed. If I missed something here or if I said it improperly. I think we started the conversation, and Amanda did a great job of reminding us all that this is not just AI, but we're really talking about generative and conversational AI, the use of the technology in that fashion. I think everybody has the common belief that this is going to be far more intrusive than we think, far more comprehensive in where it impacts people and the changes that it's going to require, and the ultimate societal impact that it creates. I think good pedagogy rules is a conversation. If you're doing it with the right methodologies for learning and individualizing, that's always going to win out. That's always the best way to use technology. Always has, and we've reiterated this and reinforced this time and time again. I think that the places where equity plays here are really very, very diverse to talk about this. It's teachers versus students. It's those that are tech savvy versus those that aren't. The racial or social biases are there. And when we don't when we don't address those properly, the gaps get larger. So we have to pay particular attention to that. And we also have to continue to check our work, because if we trust this too much, we could be running down a rat hole, and the hallucinations are, it's a funny term, but the reality of it is they become real, they become factual for people. And that's far more damaging than getting the wrong answer in some other fashion. I think that the final question about where we're going, I think, is really about, and everybody said it in a little different way, but my takeaway from that is we have to meet people where they are and use this tool to support them for the things that they need to have, want to accomplish, can contribute. So we're still people, and we all have to be able to understand the individual challenges and opportunities and contributions that we can make. And this tool can, in the right way, be very, very positive in that effort. So, what did I miss? Did I summarize that quickly?
You did a great job.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys have been fabulous guests. I hope we can have this conversation again, because I think there's so much to learn. You guys have so much to offer. And by the time we're able to coordinate a schedule, the world's going to change that much more. So I thank you so much for your time and your contributions. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and hope all of you at home have as well. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
Thank you for listening. ClassLink is proud to be the meeting place to facilitate these conversations. If you have a topic idea, send it to perspectives@classlink.com. To keep hearing our perspectives, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.